In the winter of 1984, in a small town near Freiburg, in southern Germany, a clinical case involving a child of just 6 years old began to circulate discreetly among doctors, psychologists, and researchers interested in near-death experiences. It was an episode that, due to the precision of the accounts and the way it challenged established concepts of the time, would end up being mentioned years later in academic circles linked to the work of Elizabeth Kübler-Ross, whose research on death and dying had become a worldwide reference. Ross did not follow the case directly, but the retrospective analysis of her theoretical models, confronted with what the child described, generated dense debates about consciousness, memory, and the limits between life and death. The story begins on a chilly morning in February. The Schneider family was on their way to school when the car lost control on a thin layer of ice and collided with an old stone wall, typical of the small rural roads in the region. The impact did not seem so serious for the adults, but the boy, Lucas, sitting in the back seat, was thrown against the vehicle's column. The admitting diagnosis at Freiburg University Hospital registered moderate craniocerebral trauma, with loss of consciousness for more than 8 minutes. Enough time for the emergency team to classify the episode as a potential brief respiratory arrest situation. What caught the doctor's attention was not only the boy's surprisingly quick stabilization, but what came after, still in the recovery room, when he should have been confused and disoriented. Lucas opened his eyes and murmured a sentence that made the nurse in charge interrupt the routine procedure. With a weak but clear voice, he said, "I saw you from above, all of you." The nurse, experienced in emergency care, would later report that that sentence did not match the expected post-traumatic state, much less the child's age. The clinical records show that, as soon as he recovered neurological stability, the boy described with precision details of the care that he could not have observed. He talked about the scissors that fell out of the paramedic's pocket. He mentioned the blue button on the ambulance dashboard, something that, according to the driver himself, the child would never have seen. As he recounted the events, the tone was calm, linear, almost clinical. "I was on top of the light," he explained, referring to the surgical lamp in the emergency room. "You were talking fast, as if time was running out." In the following days, the neurology team noted every detail. There were no signs of delirium, fever, prolonged hypoxia, or any metabolic alteration capable of producing a typical hallucination. Lucas's description corresponded, in an almost disconcerting way, to the emerging literature on near-death experiences, a literature that, at the time, still faced resistance within European medical settings, despite the growing influence of Kübler-Ross's work in the international debate. The family, of moderate Protestant background and with no history of mystical beliefs, was hesitant to interpret the episode spiritually. However, upon noticing the certainty with which the boy spoke, a certainty unusual for a child subjected to recent trauma, they agreed to participate in a formal psychological evaluation. It was the beginning of a clinical report that would place classical medical models and new discussions about consciousness intention. During the first days of psychological observation, conducted by a team that followed the methodologies widely disseminated by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross at the time, it was noteworthy that Lucas maintained a stable narrative, without typical variations of childhood confabulation. The boy described his experience with the objectivity of someone who was simply trying to report what he saw, without the need to impress or dramatize, a characteristic that, according to clinical literature, usually differentiates vivid memories from imaginative constructions. The responsible psychologist, Dr. Maren Vogel, recorded that, when asked to describe again what had happened at the moment of losing consciousness, the boy closed his eyes for a few seconds before responding, slowly. "I heard a snap. Then everything went dark, but it wasn't a bad dark. It was just silence. And then I was up there." When the psychologist asked where up there was, Lucas raised his hand, pointing to the white ceiling of the evaluation room. "On top of the light, I saw everything. I saw Mommy crying and the doctor with the metal thing in his hand." the observation was precise. His mother, who had been in the room for a few minutes before the intensive care, had indeed cried silently. And the metal thing, as he called it, corresponded to the laryngoscope used by the doctor. The instrument, however, was never visible from the child's position during the initial care, a point that generated great discussion among the doctors involved. In the clinical report, the team recorded that there were no signs of post-traumatic delirium, nor signs of convulsive activity that could justify fragmented perceptions. The neurological evaluation revealed only mild edema and no structural injury that would suggest severe perceptual distortions. Therefore, the team considered the phenomenon an atypical near-death experience, comparable to those documented in the international literature developed starting in the 1970s, when Kübler-Ross began systematically presenting similar accounts in adult patients. However, what made the case even more unique was the second part of the boy's narrative, something that few pediatric cases in the German literature of the time had clearly registered. In one of the clinical meetings, already on the 4th day of hospitalization, the boy spontaneously commented, "I met a woman. She said I needed to go back." The psychologist, rigorously following the methodological guidelines for non-directive interviews, only asked, "Did you know this woman?" Lucas shook his head. She had light behind her, but it wasn't strong. It was like when the window gets bright in the morning. The clinical diaries show that, although the team avoided any immediate interpretation, the description resembled elements found in adult accounts analyzed by Kübler-Ross in previous decades. However, what most surprised the professionals was the way the boy described the emotional sensation of the encounter. "She didn't speak with her mouth, but I understood. She wasn't sad or happy. She just knew." This aspect, the perception of communication without verbal language, described by a child who was barely beginning to master complex sentences, caught the attention of the professionals in Freiburg. The clinical observation was recorded as an indication of a non-sensory experience, a term that, although controversial, was gaining ground in international comparative studies. When he was finally discharged, the team decided to follow the case over the following months, structuring a longitudinal follow-up that would subsequently be one of the most complete of the decade in the German context. The questions remained open. To what extent is the infant brain capable of producing such detailed perceptions during a trauma? And why did the account align so deeply with what the adult literature already described? In the months following the hospital discharge, the longitudinal follow-up conducted by the Freiburg team became more detailed. The intention was to understand if Lucas's account would change over time, something common in childhood memories, or if it would remain stable, as happened in many adult cases studied by Kübler-Ross. What surprised the professionals was precisely the consistency. At each new session, the boy repeated the sequence of events with the same order, the same descriptions, and the same serene tone, without fanciful additions or elements influenced by external questions. The German routine of the Schneider family remained simple. The father, an industrial mechanical technician, worked shifts in a local factory. The mother divided her time between a part-time job and caring for Lucas. As part of the protocol, the psychologist Dr. Vogel visited the house every 2 weeks. On these occasions, she sought to observe the boy's daily behavior, his playtime, his level of concentration, any potential new nightmares or fears. None of this appeared. On the contrary, he seemed even more attentive and calm than before the accident, according to the mother's own report. He became more serious. It's as if he saw something that we don't see. The most intriguing point of the follow-up came about 2 months after the episode. During one of the interviews, Lucas described in more detail the environment he found himself in during the loss of consciousness. He said, "There was no floor, but it wasn't space either. It was nothing." But a good nothing. Asked by the psychologist how he knew he was outside the body, he answered in a surprisingly logical way for his age. "I didn't feel the weight. And when I tried to touch my hand, it wasn't there. This type of self-report, out-of-body perception with the absence of tactile sensation, had already been described in adults, but was extremely rare in children so young, mainly due to the difficulty in translating abstract concepts into verbal language. Lucas's clarity placed the case in a gray area between a perceptive phenomenon and a phenomenon of expanded consciousness, as suggested by some researchers linked to theories of consciousness transition that, in a way, dialogued with later reflections by Kübler-Ross herself about existential continuity. The school also collaborated with the monitoring. Lucas's teacher reported that the boy, who was previously scattered in some activities, now showed greater focus and seemed to observe his colleagues with a type of contemplative, almost adult, attention. In one of the reports sent to the clinical team, she wrote, "He describes things as if he had experienced something bigger than he understands. He doesn't talk much about it, but when he does, it is with naturalness, as if he were just saying that he saw the sky get bright." The Freiburg team, following the protocols of scientific neutrality, avoided any direct spiritual interpretation. The goal was to understand if the phenomenon could be explained by neurological mechanisms, such as trauma-induced dissociation, reconstructed memory, or anomalous perceptive experience, or if it fit into the more complex category of near-death experiences described in the international literature. Most neurological models, however, did not convincingly explain the precision of the objective details reported by Lucas during the initial care. Little by little, the case began to circulate discreetly in academic meetings, especially in debates about child consciousness. One of the neurologists involved even mentioned at a conference held in 1986 that the case dialogued with elements observed by Kübler-Ross, although it presented unique features of child perception. The comment aroused interest, but also caution, since the traditional German medical community maintained a conservative stance towards borderline phenomena. As the follow-up progressed, it became evident that the account was not weakening. On the contrary, it remained intact and surprisingly serene. This led the team to investigate not only what Lucas saw, but how that altered his emotional understanding of life and death, something that would become central to the next phase of the study. In the fourth month of follow-up, the Freiburg team decided to deepen Lucas's emotional and cognitive evaluation, seeking to understand if the reported experience had produced lasting impacts on his perception of life and, above all, of death. This point was especially relevant because in many accounts analyzed by Elizabeth Kübler-Ross throughout her career, behavioral changes after near-death experiences appeared as consistent markers, even when the narrated content varied from individual to individual. Dr. Maren Vogel initiated a series of sessions in a controlled environment using clinical interview techniques adapted for children, always with open questions and rigorous observation of nonverbal reactions. It was during one of these sessions that Lucas revealed an aspect not yet mentioned, the sensation of returning to the body. Sitting in front of the psychologist with a simple drawing in his hand, something he did to relax, he said, almost casually, "Coming back hurt. It didn't hurt outside. It hurt when I went in." This type of description was not common in child cases, and it drew attention because it aligned, unexpectedly, with accounts from adults that Kübler-Ross had documented during her years of research. The psychologist asked, "Do you remember what that was like?" Lucas nodded. "It was fast, like falling. I saw the woman, and then I felt like the air got heavy, and then I woke up with people talking loudly." In the clinical report, the team recorded that the narrative did not present elements of panic, fantasy, or fear, aspects that normally appear when children try to explain something they do not fully understand. On the contrary, he reported everything naturally, as if describing an everyday event. The parents confirmed that, at home, the boy did not show anxiety when talking about the experience, nor did he seek attention when mentioning it. The mother reported, "He talks as if it were a normal memory, like when he talks about the park or school. The team then decided to review the initial neurological exams, looking for any indication that could support a physiological explanation. The trauma had been moderate, without significant lesions, and the period of unconsciousness, although prolonged for a child, had not exceeded limits associated with severe damage. The absence of subsequent hallucinations, cognitive distortions, and temporal inconsistencies in the account reinforced the difficulty of framing the phenomenon within the traditional models of post-traumatic dissociation. At the same time, the team was concerned about avoiding premature conclusions. Germany in the 1980s maintained a rigorous medical environment where topics like out-of-body consciousness were treated with great caution. Therefore, the preliminary presentation of the case was constructed cautiously, describing only the observable elements: narrative stability, precision of objective details, and absence of pathological signs. During a home visit, already in the 5th month of follow-up, the psychologist observed something that would add an emotional layer to the case. While the mother was preparing tea, a common habit in southern German homes, especially in the prolonged winter, Lucas was playing on the living room rug with small wooden pieces. Suddenly, without apparent stimulus, he said, "The woman said it wasn't my time." The sentence was spoken without drama, without a pause, as a spontaneous comment about a memory that had just reappeared. The psychologist, following the protocol, did not ask directed questions. But she later recorded that, for the first time, the boy mentioned an explicit message attributed to the figure he encountered during his experience. This message, simple, direct, and devoid of symbolism, reinforced a characteristic already observed by Kübler-Ross in similar accounts: the absence of metaphorical language in young children, who tend to report the experience exactly as they perceive it. From that moment on, the investigation would take a new direction. The team needed to understand if the event had modified the boy's emotional perception of his own mortality, and to what extent this impact could be compared to the patterns described by Kübler-Ross in classic analyses of patients who went through similar experiences. In the final months of the follow-up, the Freiburg team began to concentrate less on the phenomenology of the experience, already extensively documented, and more on the emotional transformations that the episode seemed to have caused in Lucas. This focus directly followed Elisabeth Kübler-Ross's line of investigation, who always emphasized that near-death experiences, especially when reported consistently, usually produce a profound reorganization of the individual's perception of finiteness, fear, and existential meaning. Although Ross never had direct contact with this specific case, her works became the interpretative axis adopted by the professionals to understand what was unfolding before them. The final evaluation took place in June 1985, as the German summer began to soften the landscape around the Schneider family's house. On a clear afternoon, the psychologist Dr. Vogel proposed a free conversation with the boy, now almost completely recovered from the physical trauma. The goal was not to revise the account itself, but to explore how he understood what had happened. Lucas, sitting next to the open window, observing the trees swaying in the warm wind, responded naturally when asked if he felt fear of death after that experience. "No," he said, "it's just like sleeping, but lighter." This sentence, simple and direct, became one of the central points of the clinical report. According to the protocols inspired by Kübler-Ross, the way children express their perceptions about death usually reveals whether there is the presence of latent anxiety, emotional withdrawal, or an attempt at rationalization. In Lucas's case, there was none of that. The tone was calm, devoid of anguish. He seemed to be describing not a belief, but an intimate knowledge acquired unexpectedly. A second aspect caught attention: the absence of negative behavioral changes. Unlike cases where trauma leads to states of hypervigilance, regression, or recurrent nightmares, Lucas demonstrated emotional stability, increasing school performance, and an uncommon maturity for his age. The teacher reported that he began helping shy colleagues during activities and demonstrating spontaneous compassion in conflict situations. something that the literature on post-trauma would hardly explain alone. In a final interview with the parents, the team asked if the boy continued to mention the female figure he had seen during the experience. The mother replied, "Sometimes, but never with fear. He talks about her as if she were someone known, even without knowing who she is." This strange, yet serene familiarity echoed patterns already observed by Kübler-Ross in adult accounts, who frequently described figures of welcome without necessarily attributing a specific identity. In consolidating the study, the team highlighted three central elements: the objective precision of the initial account, the narrative stability over the months, and the subsequent emotional transformation marked by serenity and absence of anxiety. These elements made the case not only consistent, but especially valuable for the academic debate. Although they avoided metaphysical conclusions, the professionals admitted that the phenomenon extrapolated purely neurological explanations available at the time. The final report, presented discreetly at a symposium on child consciousness and psychology in Heidelberg, mentioned that the case directly dialogued with Elizabeth Kübler-Ross's theoretical observations about the continuity of consciousness and change of perspective after borderline experiences. Not as proof, but as a clinical example of a phenomenon that challenged rigid boundaries between mind, body, and perception. Lucas grew up without presenting physical or psychological sequelae. The case formally concluded in early 1986, but continued to be cited, years later, as one of the most intriguing pediatric accounts of the decade, not for the drama, but for the sobriety with which a 6-year-old child described something that many adults can never put into words. The case, in the end, did not bring definitive answers. But, as happened with the accounts studied by Kübler-Ross, it opened up space for broader questions. Questions about what really happens in the moments when consciousness seems to cross the limits of the body. And above all, about what a child can reveal when narrating, with disconcerting simplicity, what they lived between the silence and the light.